Alright, we're going to look at the perfect storm, part 3. In this video, we're going to look further into the Great War, and more to the point, talking about some events that made it the not-so-great war. To illustrate how devastating the casualties were, let's highlight a few major battles. Now, casualties include dead, wounded, captured, or missing. Anyone who was unable to fight for his side is a casualty. The first great battle of the Great War took place in August 1914 at Tannenberg, a German town near the Russian border. Despite being outnumbered, the Germans routed the ill-equipped Russians, inflicting a huge defeat considered by some to be the most lopsided in the war. The Russians suffered around 170,000 casualties, with their Second Army almost completely annihilated. In contrast, the Germans lost around 12,000 men. Tannenberg highlighted the ineptitude of the Russian commanders and the ineffectiveness of the Russian army. Keep in mind that the casualty numbers in all these battles have been disputed over the years, but all these numbers are the best estimates I can find. In early September 1914, the German army had overrun Belgium, following the Schlieffen Plan, and they pushed towards France, threatening Paris. British and French forces made a desperate attempt to stop the German advance and consolidated their troops along the Marne River, just outside Paris. French taxis helped the Allies outflank the Germans, and the Allied victory forced the Germans to abandon the Schlieffen Plan and retreat, in an event that became known as the Miracle on the Marne. Despite the Allied victory, the battle was a costly one, and the Allied forces suffered around 260,000 casualties, while the Germans suffered 220,000. Also, the battle forced the Germans to retreat and begin building fortifications, causing the Allies to respond in kind and leading to the bloody trench warfare that would characterize the Western Front. By 1915, the war in the West had bogged down. Both sides had constructed massive trench networks and were losing men in futile assaults against the fortified positions. With the casualties mounting, the Allies decided on a gamble: open up a second front on the Dardanelles in modern-day Turkey, right along through here. A second front would hopefully break the deadlock on the Western Front and bring relief to the beleaguered Russians by opening up a sea route for resupply. As a result, the Battle of Gallipoli was waged from April 1915 to January 1916. Unfortunately for the Allies, the Turkish troops dug in and resisted, stymieing the Allied landings. Trench warfare was utilized again, and the British and Anzac forces failed to defeat the Turks. Now, Anzac stood for Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. The Allies ended up losing around 220,000 men to the Turks over 250,000. However, the Ottoman Empire earned a stunning victory. Verdun was one of the two great slaughterhouse battles of the Great War. From February to December 1916, the German offensive was partially waged against a French fortress near Verdun. But more ominously, the main goal of Germany was simply to kill so many French soldiers that it would break their morale and force them to abandon the fight. It was the longest and one of the most devastating battles in the Great War, exemplifying the meaning of war of attrition. Nearly 40 million artillery shells were exchanged during the battle, pockmarking the area with craters, some of which are still visible to this very day. Verdun was a symbol of the horrors of war and of the futility of the Great War in general. The French lost around 370,000 casualties, while the Germans lost around 330,000, and with the battle essentially ending in a stalemate. Some historians have both sides with over 400,000 casualties each. Arguably, the largest battle took place along both sides of the French river Somme from July to November 1916. It was a big push, mostly by the British, to rupture the German lines, and the French contributed significantly as well. The British hoped that a massive 5-day artillery barrage on the German lines would devastate their defenses. However, most of them were relatively safe in deep underground bunkers. On the opening day of the battle, the overconfident British Field Marshal Haig ordered his troops, many of whom were seeing their first combat, to march close together across no man's land in neat, ordered lines. As a result, the British suffered around 60,000 casualties in one day, including around 20,000 deaths, the greatest single-day loss of life in the history of the British Army. As a result, Haig was forever known as the Butcher of Somme. The battle was indecisive, but it did force the Germans to eventually withdraw. The Allies paid for it dearly, however, suffering around 620,000 casualties, including around 100 tanks and almost 800 aircraft. The Germans lost around 600,000 men. These battles, and many others, highlighted the carnage that made this not-so-great war such a devastating event in human history. After 2 years of combat, the battle lines of the Western Front between Germany and France had barely changed from the first days of the war, resulting in a stalemate. The landscape of no man's land was often pockmarked with craters from artillery fire and brutal warfare. The Eastern Front, mostly between Russia and Germany, as well as Austria-Hungary, was a different story, where battles more resembled fluid engagements of the 19th century. In fact, the Austro-Hungarian army faced a few defeats at the hands of the Russians, causing many German troops to cynically say, "We are shackled to a corpse." War was transformed from carrying the prospect of glory to unending degradation and brutality. While most of the greatest battles took place in Europe, and especially along the Western Front, this was, in fact, a world war. Japan declared war on Germany in August of 1914, honoring the Anglo-Japanese alliance, and, along with the Anzac forces, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, they attacked and overran all of Germany's Pacific colonies. India, a British colony, contributed more than 850,000 troops to support the Allies. They fought in regions like Southwest Asia and Eastern Africa, incurring thousands of casualties. They also supplied horses, camels, and war supplies. In this photograph, you can see an ammunition factory in India during the war. And even though German colonies in Africa were not particularly valuable, they could serve as staging grounds for invasions into French and British colonies. So the war expanded, and battles were fought in places like Togo, Cameroon, and other German possessions. More than 100,000 Africans were drafted to serve as soldiers and support staff, and as many as 10% of them died, mostly due to disease and malnutrition. Africa was devastated in regions where campaigning took place. Many villages were burned, crops were lost, and thousands of civilians lost their lives as well. A total war emerged where the entire nation's resources were used. Naval warfare did play a part in the Great War. For instance, the British set up a blockade of ships and sea mines around Germany to deprive them of resources, like a medieval siege around a city. And even though there was a massive buildup of ships before the Great War, only one major naval engagement did occur, and that was the Battle of Jutland off the coast of Denmark. It took place in the summer of 1916. Although the British lost more ships and twice as many sailors, neither side achieved a conclusive victory. And, as a result, Germany resorted to unrestricted submarine warfare, where the U-boats would fire on enemy ships or vessels suspected of carrying Allied supplies, without warning. Conscription was used on a massive scale. Drafts were enacted in many countries. Usually, males between 18 and 25 were eligible. However, the ages expanded in Germany to younger and older males as their casualties mounted. By the end of the war, boys as young as 15 and men into their 50s fought on the German front lines. Propaganda was also widespread, where countries attempted to influence the attitudes and morale of their citizens. It was common to exaggerate atrocities, or to use imagery to encourage patriotism. One interesting example was in the United States, where the German-sounding food sauerkraut was often called Liberty cabbage. And, since so many men had left the workforce to fight, women went to work, filling in admirably for many of the jobs. They worked in factories, and as nurses, volunteers, and so on. Rationing of many items, such as food, metals, and other supplies, was widespread. Even the Russian government banned the sale of vodka to cut down on costs. For the war effort, soldiers were fed and supplied first, then the citizens. In Germany, the British blockade was so effective that by 1916, the people were forced into eating crops normally reserved for animals in what was known as the turnip winter. Remember Charles Turnip Townsend and his contributions to crop rotation?
Yes!
To make their food last longer, bread recipes consisted of 1 part flour and 2 parts sawdust.
That sounds good. I'll have that.
There was massive malnutrition and disease, and as many as 750,000 Germans died as a result of these harsh conditions throughout the war. For the populations around the world, this was anything but a great war.